Okay, well, this is my talk, and it's called Smack Your Sass Up. Basically, my name is Mina. I'm a front-end developer. I'm originally from Wichita, Kansas, so I was very, very proud of Jeff. I currently live in Dallas, Texas. That's my Twitter and my username on pretty much every other social network. Back in Dallas, I recently started the local chapter of Girl Development there, which is an organization that strives to bridge the gender gap in the tech industry by offering affordable and accessible programming skills. So I want to tell you a brief story about how this whole talk and situation came to be. My boss once came to me and said, I need you to build 2 demo sites for that one thing we did for that one client. And it's like, oh, okay, fine, sure, I can do that. He's like, oh yeah, and by the way, I need them in 2 days. Are you kidding? That's impossible. What's wrong with you? He's like, well, it's just like you copy some CSS and you change some colors around and you lob it together. It's no big deal. CSS is easy, right? Okay, so who here thinks CSS is easy? Good, no hands, because CSS is hard. Like, really, really hard. Because you have all these classes and IDs and stuff, and then it works one way in Chrome and another way in Firefox, and IEs all fuck you, and wait a minute, how do you do this thing, and why won't you style, and you know what, damn it, just use important. So actually, you know what, CSS is kind of bullshit. It really shouldn't be this difficult, and there is a better way. It's called Modular CSS. The purpose of Modular CSS is to help make your CSS more flexible and scalable, but to also make it more readable and easier to maintain. You do this by breaking your CSS into smaller pieces so that they can be ported from one site to another. They're independent of each other, basically so that you can either move them around the page themselves or you can move them to different sites. There are lots of different philosophies that can help with this. There's MVCSS, BEM, OOCSS, Intuit, but the one I like and the one that I'm going to be talking about is called SMACSS. SMACSS stands for Scalable and Modular Architecture for CSS. It was created by Jonathan Snook. He used to work at Yahoo, now he works at Shopify. And there are a few core principles that I'm going to go over about SMACSS. The purpose of it is to make your HTML more semantic while decreasing the expectation of what that HTML structure should look like. It's not a framework. A lot of people have that misconception. It's not a framework. It's more of a philosophy. It is a way of thinking about authoring your style sheets. It doesn't force you to do anything one way. It doesn't make any assumptions and doesn't do any thinking for you. If you don't like something about the way SMACSS suggests doing it, then change it or just don't do it. There are 3 different principles that SMACSS goes over. It's categorization, naming conventions, and depth of applicability. And I'm really happy I said that word right, because I messed it up every single time. Anyway, the concept of categorization, it breaks in SMACSS, it breaks it down into 5 different categories. There's the base styles, your layout styles, your modules, states, and themes. Each one of these has their own loosely defined rules and naming conventions that they all adhere to. Your base styles would be your CSS resets and your default styles. Basically, these are just the HTML tags themselves, nothing else. And this is the bare minimum. If you do nothing else to your site, this is what it should look like. Layout styles are the grid styles and the major components of a site. And by major components, let's take a look at Apple. This is Apple's homepage. You can see it kind of has some clearly defined sections already. So a major components of this site might be the header, the content area, and then the footer. Inside of those major components, there are modules. Now, modules are the bulk of what you're going to be typing. They're the bulk of the code and the bulk of the site. Examples of modules are search boxes, buttons, navigation, whatnot. Going back to the Apple example, this is how the modules might break down on Apple's homepage. You have the navigation, which is inside the main header. Inside the content area, you have a hero image, a few promos, and inside the footer, you have some legal text and some links. States are another set of styles that describe your modules in anything but their default state. So what does it look like when this module is expanded or collapsed? What does it look like when it's hovered? What does it look like when it's on a different device? I also like to add my print styles into the states, although that's not explicitly mentioned in SMACSS' book. The last one's a little weird because most sites don't need to do this one. It's their themes. He made it for Yahoo because users have the opportunity to customize their Yahoo Mail and whatnot. So basically, it describes your modules when a different set of themes and a different set of styles are applied. The naming conventions for each of these make it easier for you to identify just by looking at the selector what type of module, what type of code you're dealing with. The idea is to name them as something that is semantic enough so that you know immediately what you're looking at, but abstract enough so that it can still be moved around the page in different sites without it making any less sense. For base styles, again, it would be just the main HTML elements, H2, H1, whatnot. For your layout styles, SMACSS suggests you name them .layout-header, .layout footer, or for a shorter version, .l- whatever. Modules, you basically would name them whatever it is you're talking about. So an example would be just .button or .list or something like that. A submodule is, as you would imagine, a subdivision of that main primary module. So if you want a button that's a secondary button, you would just say .button-secondary. States are, the naming convention for that is .is-active, .is-hidden, something like that. Usually this is where you would also use any sort of JavaScript dependencies, classes for any kind of plugins you're using. And the theme, they suggest that you use .theme- whatever it is you happen to be styling, but I don't particularly like that method because I think it adds unnecessary classes to your HTML. So I'm going to say go ahead and scratch that, and I'm going to show you later on a way that Sass can handle this a little bit better. The last principle of SMACSS is the depth of applicability. If you think of your HTML structure like a tree with parent and child elements, the depth of applicability is talking about how deep within that tree the thing you're trying to style goes. The deeper it is within the tree, the greater the depth, and the harder it is for you to port that anywhere else. Okay, so take this for example. This is not a module. This is like CSS selector hell. It would be really, really hard to maintain this. And just for full disclosure, I didn't make this up. This is something that I actually wrote a couple years ago, and I'm kind of embarrassed and ashamed of myself, but fine. Basically, if anything changes in my HTML structure, this would no longer apply, and I'd have to go back and redo something. What I really wanted to style was just a sublink in my navigation menu. So really, I could have just used a class on the anchor tag, class like something nav sub item, and that would have been a lot slicker, a lot cleaner, and it still would have achieved the same desired effect. So to recap the basic principles of SMACSS, you need to categorize your CSS rules. You need to use meaningful names, meaningful yet abstract names, so that they can still be moved from site to site and layout to layout. And make sure that your selectors are pretty shallow. They're not deeply dependent on the HTML structure itself. All right, so now that you know what SMACSS is, let's go ahead and add some Sass into the mix. By the way, Sass is not an acronym. It doesn't actually stand for anything, so there's no need to type it in all capital. It's a pet peeve of the guy who created Sass, so I feel the need to mention it every time just to kind of educate folks, so there's no need to do that. The first way that Sass can help you with SMACSS is used for namescaping. To do this, the ampersand operator is the best tool that Sass has to offer. The ampersand operator is basically a way for you to merge selectors onto each other. For example, you have a button class and you want to have a hover state on it. You would nest the hover state inside of the button class in your Sass file, and when it compiles to CSS, the parent class replaces the ampersand, and it basically merges the two together. Another example of this would be if you have your ampersand trailing your main selector, it'll still go ahead and replace that one. Now, this is all well and good, but it doesn't really help with the naming conventions I mentioned earlier because there's no way to actually connect the two. At least there wasn't until Sass 3.3. With Sass 3.3, which was released a few months ago, you can now actually add suffixes to your selectors which makes it really great for doing modules and submodule naming conventions like I mentioned earlier. So take our button example again. Now you can nest button ampersand dash secondary or underscore secondary, and it'll still go ahead and compile the way you would like it to. Speaking of nesting, there is this slight problem with Sass's nesting. If you're not too careful, you can end up with that selector hell I showed you earlier if you start nesting things too deeply. So a lot of people like to follow what they call the inception rule. You don't want to go deeper than 3 levels deep when you nest things. Otherwise, you start getting this long thing, and it defeats the purpose. But if you use the ampersand operator, like I told you before, it actually helps solve that problem a little bit, because instead of just adding on selectors, it'll go ahead and it'll chain them onto the single selector. Now, if you start nesting too deeply, you'll end up with a single selector that's long, but it won't be a nested, hard-to-maintain one. I would suggest also to be careful nesting, because if you're nesting your CSS, your Sass files that deeply, it kind of suggests you didn't abstract far enough when you made your module, so maybe you should go back and rethink something. Another good part about the nesting for Sass is that you can nest your media queries inside the module itself. So that way everything is contained within a single, everything to do with that module is contained within a single spot, so you don't have to go looking for it. What you would do is create a mixin. This is actually a mixin that I believe I found on GitHub somewhere, but you create a mixin that defines the breakpoint, the media query, and the screen type, or the type of media, I should say, of what you want the query to suggest, and then you would go ahead and include that inside your primary module along with any other submodules and styles you have going on with it. One of the downfalls of SMACSS' way of naming selectors and styling things is that you kind of end up with this thing called class-itis. In order to get the exact look you want, you may have to apply 2 or 3 classes to a single element. Now, a lot of people just thought that this was just a necessary evil to keep your CSS manageable, but if you use Sass and extend Sass, it actually helps with controlling some of that. So instead of if you extend the main primary module inside of the submodule, you can then apply simply the submodules class, and it'll have both the main module and the submodules styles. Does that make sense? Okay. Another way to do this is if you use a placeholder selector. No, placeholder selectors are unique in Sass because it doesn't actually output anything. Like the button class would not end up in your CSS output because it's not really there. Sass doesn't think it's really there. So it behaves, the outcome is the same as if you extended it, but the primary button class no longer appears in your CSS output. This can help if you're trying to reduce the size of your CSS file. You can delete some selectors, but I would be careful with this one because if you actually need to style a module that's just the primary and not the submodule, the class no longer exists in your CSS and it won't be able to do anything with it. The final rule about extends with anything else in Sass is to use it sparingly. Don't try to extend between modules because that makes them overly dependent on each other and defeats the purpose of them being modules in the first place. So if you're going to extend, make sure it's all within the same module itself. One thing I love about Sass is that it's always changing and evolving. What works today might not work tomorrow. Case in point, as I was preparing this presentation, the primary developer of Sass sent this out, saying that he just released a new version of Sass. Sass 3.4 has just been released about 2 days ago. And in it is definitely a lot of new hot stuff, but unfortunately, it might kind of negate what I just said. I haven't had to play with it yet, but let me rewind that. It won't negate what I just said. What I just said will still work, but there might be a better way to do it now. These are a couple of the selector functions that I saw he introduced. Now again, because this was released a few hours ago, I haven't had the chance to play with them, so I don't quite know how they work, but it seems really interesting that they're definitely moving towards making Sass work more with modular CSS architecture. If you want to go ahead and start playing with this is how you would install the new pre-release of Sass. I've already done it, and I'm starting to play with it now, and it's pretty cool. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is how Sass can help you with your file structure. Sass can easily chop your CSS into manageable pieces, which is great for modular architecture. You do this with imports and partials. Sass has something called a partial where it doesn't output a single CSS file, it imports just that piece into a main CSS file. So the way that I organize my Sass files is like so. First, I would import any kind of utilities that I need, anything that is variables, functions, mixins, placeholder selectors, anything that by itself doesn't actually result in CSS. It's basically just logic. After that, I import any sort of third-party dependencies I'm using, like a Font Awesome or a grid system or something like that. After that, I would do my base styles, the CSS resets, any kind of base element styles, go from there to your main major layout modules. To there, the modules themselves, the bulk of your CSS buttons and whatnot. From here, the states, the various different states, including touch and, including touch styles. Actual fonts, the font faces, if you're not using like a third-party font library and you're actually hosting your own fonts, I would put those there. And then at the very end, I would put the print styles. Now, I consider print styles to be a state, so I actually put them inside of the state structure, but I don't import them until at the very end of my Sass file. I know this seems like a lot of files to deal with, but what it does is you break everything up into such small chunks that you know exactly what it is you're looking for. And it keeps your files small and readable. Now, I know I went over that a little quickly, so basically if you want to actually see this architecture for yourself, I made this starter file that pretty much breaks everything down the way I just said. It's on GitHub. You can use this URL to go get it and play with it, fork it, do whatever you would like with it. Next, I want to talk about theming. Now, before I said that SMACSS has its own convention when it comes to theming. It states that you add a new class for every theme that you want to do. This could work, but I feel like it's really excessive. Sass has a better way of doing this. Again, you would create a mixin stating the theme that you would want to use. You name the theme some kind of variable, and then make an if statement saying if you define the variable as a certain theme, output the styles you then have written for that theme. So basically, you would say, I want a theme called Becca Purple, and you would then include your theme, Becca Purple, and then go ahead and include the styles inside of the module themselves. This way, it doesn't separate the styles, like the themes, from the module itself, and again, it keeps everything contained within that module, so you know exactly where your styles are. And you're probably saying, okay, this all sounds well and good, but I'm in the middle of a project, and I don't have time to go back and re-engineer everything I just did, and really, what's the point of all of this? Well, you don't have to go back and re-engineer everything you just did. Just take a part of it and refactor. Okay, Mina, but my style sheets look kind of like this, and how am I supposed to get through all this mess? Well, yeah, do I really need to do that part? I would suggest just take some baby steps. Just do it as small as possible. Basically, just extract one component that you want to refactor. Say you want to do just this top menu bar or maybe the sidebar. Take one small component, write some variables that can then you've noticed are used across various modules. Apply the naming conventions to that module, which means you may have to do some HTML re-engineering there. Just apply the classes. And then nest and extend your submodules like I showed you before. And I actually have an example of me doing just that. This menu I'm showing you, this is actually what was the result of that crazy code I showed you at the very beginning. And so I have refactored it using the principles that I have been telling you about now. So you can see the before and you can see the after. The menu looks exactly the same, but the code is definitely a lot cleaner. When I refactored that, before I refactored it, my CSS was 161 lines for that one drop-down menu. After I refactored it using SMACSS conventions and Sass, I got it down to 97 lines. And so that's just one menu. You can imagine what the benefits would be if you did that across your entire site. So to recap what I just went over about Sass, you can namespace using the ampersands and extends, using nesting to keep everything within one module. Break your modules into individual partials in your file structure, so that way everything is contained in one spot, but very easy to find. And refactor slowly. There's no need to go about it. Try to attack the entire thing. There are a few resources that can help you with this. First of all, if you haven't read this book, I would suggest you get it. This is the book that basically I'm basing my entire talk on. This is The Philosophy, SMACSS by Jonathan Snook. It's pretty cheap, I think like $15, so definitely get it. The Sass actual website itself is great. It has a lot of documentation about what Sass is capable of. And SassMeister, which I love this site, because if you don't want to commit to Sass right away, you can go ahead and go to this site. You can play around with Sass and see everything compiled in the browser right away, so you can test the theories without having to go the route of installing and all of that. And yeah, I am done. So this is you can get my slides here, and I guess I have time for questions if anybody has any. Yeah. Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, please go to the mic.
So does the import occur server-side, and is there any effect on performance of caching versus using like external CSS files and standard CSS?
This all takes place before you even put it on the server. Sass is not, you don't use Sass on the server, you use it locally, and then you put your CSS on the server itself. So there will be no effect any more than it would be with a regular CSS file.
Something I've seen happening with using Sass is an explosion of selectors that run up against browser limits on the number of selectors, specifically like having to support IE8. Do you have any design patterns that you suggest that would kind of get around that?
Okay, let me make sure I understand your question. You said that Sass sort of makes too many selectors and it comes across the IE8 selector limit. Is that what you're saying?
Sure. Like whenever you have a bunch of stuff that's nested, it generates a new selector for each nested item. Mm-hmm. So you can inadvertently have an explosion of your number of selectors. Mm-hmm. What would be a good design pattern to avoid that?
One design pattern would be definitely limit your nesting to no more than 3, maybe even 2. There's one thing that I didn't mention that could help you at least with the media query part of it, because when you do mixins for Sass, it actually duplicates whatever is inside that mixin. There is a gem, I believe it's called Sass Media Query Combiner. What it does is it scans your Sass file for all the media queries you have and combines them all into one singular one like you would if you wrote it yourself. That's one way you can help at least to take away some of the selectors there. Other than that, just basically be very careful when you write your Sass. Don't do anything in Sass that you would output CSS that you wouldn't write yourself, I guess. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? No? Want me to dance? No, you really don't, actually. No, that's a horrible idea. Forget I said that. Okay, well, I guess I'm done then. I'll be up here if anybody wants to come up and talk to me, but thank you all for listening.